There are liars, there are pathological liars, and there is Donald Trump. Donald Trump's lying is so routine, and the news media knows that it is so routine, that everyone has, to varying degrees, gotten used to it. It has always been impossible for any interviewer of Donald Trump to keep up with the lies that he tells at very high speed in every interview. They are frequently lies that an interviewer could not possibly anticipate, and that's what happened to Bret Baier when Donald Trump said this.
One of the things that really I'm happy is that the soldiers that died in Korea, their remains are going to be coming back home. And we have thousands of people that have asked for that. Thousands and thousands of people. So many people asked when I was on the campaign, I'd say, wait a minute, I don't have any relationship. But they said, when you can, President, we'd love our son to be brought back home. You know, the remains.
So thousands and thousands of parents of American soldiers killed in the Korean War asked candidate Donald Trump to have their remains brought home. So where's the lie in that? It is in the number. It wasn't thousands and thousands of parents. It was zero. That never happened. Donald Trump never met a single parent of an American soldier killed in the Korean War during the presidential campaign. The Washington Post estimates that most parents of a soldier killed in the Korean War would have been between 102 and 111 years old during the Trump presidential campaign. In other words, most of them were not alive during the presidential campaign, and the ones who might be alive were not fighting their way to the front of a rope line to talk to Donald Trump. He will lie about anything and everything. Nothing is sacred to him. And every once in a while, we just have to stop. We have to pause over that because it is a national emergency. It is something we have never seen before, and it is something we must never get used to. Imagine what would happen if any Democrat, even any other Republican, lied about the parents of America's military who were killed in action, sharing their grief with them. Donald Trump is trying to steal the grief of the now dead parents of soldiers killed in the Korean War and pretend that he shared their grief with them and that he accomplished something for them when talking to the North Korean dictator who has reportedly charged the United States $1 million every time he has allowed the returns of the remains of a single American soldier. Stealing grief is a Donald Trump specialty. Here he is lying about losing friends of his on 9/11 during the presidential campaign.
I lost hundreds of friends. The World Trade Center came down during the rain. He kept us safe. That's not safe.
Hundreds of friends. When I saw that, I immediately tweeted that Donald Trump was lying when he said during the South Carolina debate that he lost hundreds of friends. And so the next day on Meet the Press, Donald Trump reduced his claim from hundreds of friends to many, many friends.
I was there. I lost many, many friends in that tragedy. That was the worst tragedy in the history of this country, worse than Pearl Harbor.
And when I saw that, I immediately tweeted that that was a lie, too. Donald Trump did not lose many, many friends. But Donald Trump was telling so many lies then, as he is now, that no one caught up with that one. A few days later, Michael Daly in the Daily Beast was the only other member of the news media to report on Donald Trump's lie about losing hundreds of friends on 9/11. Again, the lie is in the number. And the real number, again, is zero. Donald Trump lost zero friends on 9/11. Donald Trump attended zero 9/11 funerals. Donald Trump stole the grief of hundreds of families who lost a loved one on 9/11 and tried to make it his own for political reasons. That is how deep and perverse Donald Trump's lying is. Donald Trump's lying is worse. It is uglier than any other public liar in American history. And this week, he lied for political advantage about the families of the Korean War dead in the same breath that he praised the North Korean dictator who holds on to power in North Korea through murder and torture and terrorizing the entire population of North Korea. You are never going to see a satisfying interview of Donald Trump, an interview where he is successfully challenged on every lie, because Donald Trump will never submit to an interview where that could possibly happen. And the news media is never going to be able to keep up with all of Donald Trump's lies after he tells them. And so you, as a citizen, have a new job. You must protect yourselves from the lies of Donald Trump. You must do your own homework to expose Donald Trump's lies to yourself and your family and your friends and your fellow citizens. The President of the United States is a deeply sick, pathological, and perverse liar who will lie about anything at any time, and that changes utterly the nature of your job as a citizen. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.